I've described Mathew Franklin Whittier's literary legacy as a vast tapestry, and today I'm going to start with the series that I recently discovered, K.N. Pepper and P. Pepper Pod, in the Knickerbocker, and I'm going to go from there and just see what kind of connections branch out from that one. So first we're going to start with volume 44 of the Knickerbocker. This is the November 1854 edition. And here's a copy. I mentioned that I had actually several now that are in pristine condition. This is one of them. It's just, I did put plastic on it, but it's just in unbelievable shape. So here in the November 1854 edition, the editor of that journal introduces a poem that was sent in by K.N. Pepper. Well, K.N. Pepper is this countrified character who imagines he's a great poet, and his work is being sent in by P. Pepper Pod, his friend. So being encouraged, of course, this is one of Matthew's old gags, being encouraged, this fellow keeps sending in material and really imagines himself an inspired poet. Well, Mathew Franklin Whittier is an inspired poet behind it. So you have an idiot, but behind it is an excellent author and a real poet. And the two interconnect in terms of some of their subjects. So let's see. I think I'll read the letter. It's quite short. Mr. L. Gaylord Clark, Esquire. He's writing from Demosthenes proper, Demosthenes Circle, I think it is. And here he says, Mr. Editor, after a long silence of upwards of 8 months, in consequence of being fur removed from everything by a lake a-fishing for my health, I have now returned home to die. There's no reason why I shouldn't, as I haven't got nothing to live for now. The girl he loves, that fell in love with instantly, has been pulled away from him by her cruel father. That's another whole plot. My tale shall never be told to anybody, much less to her. I have only communicate the secret to one friend. Nobody else couldn't buy it for money. But I mean to keep a writing poetry all the while till I can't hold a pen. Then, says I, ghost go up. I'll welcome death quickly, unless a certain old tyrant soon expires, meaning the cruel father, which ain't probable, as mean men never die. But the world shall think I'm, I don't know what GA is supposed to be. My poems shall be wrote so careless. Enclosed is a node, meaning an ode, to the Greek slave, which please send to the committee, if not too late, as I fear. If so, please keep the same as a memento of the moral carrig, I don't know what K-E-R-I-G-E is, of yours for a few days only, K.N. Pepper. P.S. I don't care about the $100. Give the money to some young man as is just married to the object of his choice and starting into business. What do I want of money? I'd like it perhaps if that old tyrant, but I say no more. Excuse my emotions, they'm overpowering and dangerous. KNP. Now, that's his introductory letter. Of course, he's again referring to this girl he fell in love with whose father kept them apart. This was autobiographical for Mathew. That happened with him and Abby, so he's kind of revisiting his past with Abby in this. This is something he did very often. He's joking around. He's presenting this ignoramus character, and yet the ignoramus character, under cover of clownishness, is actually telling some of his very deeply personal history, usually concerning Abby and their courtship or their marriage. Now we have a node, meaning an ode, to the Greek slave. And this is teensy-weensy type once again, so I'm going to bring this light down where I can read it. Once more my pen assume once more the traces of blank verse. Once more spring lightly into 'em. Don't jerk. Go calm and quiet, but get on fire gradually, my pen, and give the subject convulsions. Statue! Good heavens, where's me eyes? I'm blind. Stun pictor, hail! In consequence of your glory, I shall be compelled to have a operation performed for a cataract immediately. I thought I could go this slow, but I see it can't be done. You'm all-powerful. Your influence is such I'm all of a tremble, and if feel a sort of sickness creeping into my stomach, slow but sure, like a gimlet into a board. Was you all sculpt from one piece? Say perfection. Haven't you got no joints made, or putty nor nothink? But no, I feel you'm perfect. I think at least that Powers' story oughter be give air, to which says you'm all hack out of a marble stun, meaning stone. Immortal Powers, what a genius for sculpt. And I won't read the whole poem here. That's enough. You get the idea of how how K.N. Pepper praises The Greek Slave by Hiram Powers. Now, let's go to a serious poem in The Carpetbag, the March 7, 1852 edition, which I don't have a physical copy of, but I have a microfilm copy of. Let's see here. This is signed A. Trunk. I've read from this series before. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier, branching off from Trismegistus, which was not Benjamin Drew, as the editor opined in his memoirs. I can prove all of that. And to the matter of proof and skepticism, I'm going to need that for the Kindle. It's very tempting for the skeptic or the cynic when I present these things to say, that's not proof, that's not proof, that's not proof. And it isn't, because I don't have time to give the proof. I have the evidence. The thing is, it would take 5 or 6 hours, and would you sit through a 5 or 6 hour video? I don't think so. So the problem with that is that it's true that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but extraordinary evidence, as I've said many times, takes time. And that takes the sincerity of the skeptic to take the time to look at the evidence. See, you can't just assume that the person doesn't have the evidence. If he has the evidence, then the ball's in your court, and it's up to you to actually take the time to look at the evidence with an open mind. That's the break, the part that doesn't actually happen, and that betrays the hypocrisy of the cynics who are not really skeptics. Now, this is the third in the series. This is a visit to Amory Hall, but an Amory Hall was a panorama of the Crystal Palace, which was the World's Fair in London in 1851. This was a panorama, I think it was sponsored by P.T. Barnum, in Amory Hall in Boston of the Crystal Palace. Matthew had gone there to review it, but he's a reporter for the comic Carpetbag, but he's writing in verse, so he's reporting in verse. And it's both humorous and serious at the same time. I've gone over the first one, which we won't go back through again. But in the middle of this, it's called A Poetic Peep at the World's Fair. He sees the Greek slave, and he writes a separate little poem just for the Greek slave, and that's what we're going to look at here. The Greek slave. Within the Moslem mart she stands, a captive Greek, with fettered hands, but on her lip and in her eye still lives the quenchless majesty, o'ershadowed now, but unsubdued within her proudly swelling breast, and in her mute and tearless mood we read a quiet far from rest. The agonizing thought is there, that scornful eyes survey her shame, and, knitted in a fixed despair, controls the tremblings of her frame. They shall not see a Grecian shrink, though slavery's cup be hard to drink. She stands within the Moslem mart, her limbs enchained, but not her heart. Her soul has wings, and skims sublime the chronicles of early time, when Greeks were men and Greece was young, and Sunian maidens proud and fair, when burning Sappho loved and sung, and Orpheus charmed the listening air. What recks she of the fetters wrought with impious force around her arms? They cannot chain the viewless thought, nor rob a line from beauty's charms. The captive Greek has captive taken the world in love's resistless chain. That's the same poet as K.N. Pepper. So we know that Matthew loved the Greek slave. So let me see. Let me clear the decks a little bit. We got a bunch more stuff here. That leads us to the Boston Chronotype. Now, the Boston Chronotype launched in, I think it was 1846, which ran until about 1850, was headed up by Elijah Wright, who was a friend of both of the Whittier brothers, John Greenleaf Whittier and Mathew Franklin Whittier, involved heavily in the anti-slavery movement and the American Anti-Slavery Society. He permitted Matthew to write anything he wanted, as sarcastic as he wanted. They were good friends. Matthew was not constrained at all by this editor, only, of course, he wrote under pseudonyms. One of the pseudonyms he used, however, when he lived in New York City during the mid-1840s, was barely disguised, which is rather strange. It's XFW instead of MFW. And he wrote every other day for like a year or two. I mean, it's a vast number of letters from New York City, where Matthew was living and working, to Elijah Wright for the Boston Chronotype. Now, during the same period, Matthew was writing as his long accustomed signature, the Star, for the New York Tribune. That entire body of work has been mistakenly attributed by historians to Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist. She was the literary editor of that paper, but she did not write the Star reviews and essays. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, probably as a freelancer or ghostwriter of some kind. He also wrote in 1846 and 1847 for the first humor magazine in America, patterned after Britain's Punch. That was Yankee Doodle. That, at least in its second year, that humor magazine was edited by Cornelius Matthews, and he will come up soon. But meanwhile, we have all of these letters from XFW to Elijah Wright, from Mathew Franklin Whittier in New York City to Elijah Wright. On September 2nd, 1847, I'll be able to put this up on the screen because I photographed it at Brown Library here in Portland, but I don't have a physical copy of this. He says, writing New York, Friday morning, August 27, 1847 is when he's writing this. It's in the September 2nd, 1847 edition of the Weekly Chronotype, in case anybody wants to look it up. He says, "My dear Chron," which is how he addresses Elijah Wright, "though you will already have seen what the newspaper critics have to say respecting the Greek slave of Powers," meaning Hiram Powers, "you must grant me a little space to give vent to my enthusiastic admiration for this transcendent work of genius. To say all that one feels about it is impossible, or if it were possible to put the feeling into language, it could hardly fail of seeming extravagant to all who had not been under the same irresistible charm. Whatever praise has been bestowed upon it, doubtfully as you may have regarded it hitherto, will seem only tame to you when you come to see it for yourself. Its life, its beauty, its womanly majesty are omnipotent. Gazing upon it in silence, the spectator is moved to kneel as before a shrine of the highest. Never was his heart so lifted to purer and more sacred spheres by any artist. No gorgeous temple with its crowd of worshippers, its incense, and its chanting choirs ever breathed more truly and potently the soul of religion. You leave it a wiser, a better, but not a sadder man, and never can you quite lose that beautiful impression, that form which is not merely beautiful, but is beauty itself. That sweet, noble countenance remains with you like a living presence, but I shall seem extravagant to you, and so forbear. Only when you see the statue, you will confess that I was in the right. Now, I feel, and there's some reasons to say this objectively, that this statue reminded Matthew of Abby rather strongly. I don't think he had any paintings of her at this time. I think he'd given the one he had away in a fit of stoicism early on when he was still in emotional shock. So he was deeply affected by any artwork that really looked like her. There's several examples of this. I think that was the case with the Greek slave. It's not the only reason he praised it, but I think it's secretly, I would say it's one of them. Let's see, goes down a little bit about Mr. Powers, and I won't continue with that. In the next edition, next weekly edition, September 9, 1847. Remember, this is about, this is all roughly in the same era now. It was, 6 years later that he wrote as Cayenne Pepper. He's annoyed about something that's going on with the post office and deliveries and so on. Then he says, but I scarcely ought to fall into such a passion, even at the post office arrangements. I have just come from my daily half-hour study of the Greek slave, a capital specific against anger, which grows upon the eye at every new interview. I have learned that Powers is a constant student of the famous Swedenborg, meaning Emanuel Swedenborg, the spiritualist, and that he confesses freely his great indebtedness to his writings. In them, he says, is a wholly new philosophy of art, with new principles from which new practical methods are to be derived. It was from this point that Powers first took his departure from the antique, and in the Eve and Greek slave laid the foundations of a new school of sculpture, the school of humanity. Of course, this is, in the nature of the case, a higher order of art than has ever before existed, for while it practices a minuter, more careful, and more scientific attention to details, and indeed to all the practical parts of the art, it is inspired by a higher, purer, and more universal sentiment. And he goes on about how the exhibition is doing monetarily, the weather, and so on. Now, there's themes and writing elements that consistently run through Matthew's work under all of these different pseudonyms. One is, of course, that anything that reminds him of Abby is sacred. One of them is that he's fascinated by genius and inspired work. One of them is that he's a spiritualist and for a long period of time apparently was a Swedenborgian, self-identified, and later on he kind of moved away from that church but still honored Swedenborg's teachings. And he also is fascinated and interested in artists and writers and other creative people, scientists as well. He visits them and, if possible, he promotes them. So all of those elements are seen here. Okay, so we'll go back to the weekly September 2nd, 1847, the letter written August 27, 1847. Now, this was a clue that led me to Yankee Doodle. He says, as XFW, which is clearly MFW, writing to his longtime friend and editor, Elijah Wright, and he's published a great deal of his known Ethan Spike pieces in the Chronotype. I would like the first, not counting the very first one, the first 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever were in the Chronotype. So we can definitely tie Mathew Franklin Whittier to the Chronotype. He says, I noticed that Yankee Doodle of this week announces that he has found me out and that I am an assistant on an evening paper in this city. So we now have an identifier for XFW. I congratulate him on the discovery, but confess my surprise at his impudence. Now this is Cornelius Matthews. Before he made any farther allusion to your correspondent, Mr. Cron, he should have paid his debts and solemnly given guarantee that he would never attempt to swindle unfortunate and too confiding authors again. A bankrupt like Yankee ought to turn an honest man or else hold his tongue forever. Now, this is about the time that Yankee Doodle folded. Matthew had been writing for this magazine for a couple years. And the last series that he did several series, but the last one he did was a character named Joshua Greening, who once again, as Mathew repeated this theme over and over and over during his life, it's autobiographical, the country bumpkin who comes to the big city. Well, Mathew himself, as a boy of 12, was a country bumpkin who came to Boston and New York as a runaway, and then again at 14 when he finally left home for good. At 12, he wrote Joe Strickland, which, as far as I can tell, was the very first time anybody had used heavy Yankee dialect in humorous writing in America. So he launched that genre in America. This is before Seba Smith, before Sam Slick, before any of them. Well, he did it again with this Joshua Greening person. And the title of this series was Various Attempts to See the Elephant, made in the city of New York by the spring and summer of 1847 by Joshua Greening of Escopus, which was a little town in New York that he supposedly came from. Now, I only have a reprint of this, but let's see if I can. There it is. Various Attempts to See the Elephant. And there's quite a few of them. Well, this is the one that apparently, while this magazine was folding, that Cornelius Matthews did not pay him. See, he'd run out of money, and apparently they had an argument, and as a result, Cornelius Matthews decided to try to out Mathew Franklin Whittier, which was the nastiest thing anybody could do, basically, with Mathew, in his opinion. So, long story short, Mathew has reflected this in his XFW letter to the Chronotype, and he has said that Cornelius Matthews has announced that he has found me out and that I am an assistant on an evening paper in the city. Well, he hadn't found him out. I mean, he was working for him. He just outed him. Well, what evening paper in the city? It so happens that the New York Evening Mirror was carrying a few pieces by Mathew, including under a pseudonym named Pinto, which I've talked about before. Well, this is the October 22nd, 1847 edition of the New York Evening Mirror. It's signed with Mathew's star. This is after a year, a little more than a year after he stopped using that pseudonym in the New York Tribune. That's the series that's been mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller. Well, here he is again. He's back in New York City. He's now working for the Evening Mirror, and he's still signing with his star. He'd used that since 1829. The latest he used it was 1873. He used it off and on his entire life. It was always his. It was never Margaret Fuller's. She just appropriated it, as did Henry Ward Beecher later on, right after Margaret Fuller died. In the Independent, Henry Ward Beecher started writing the Star papers, see? But it didn't belong to either one of them. So here, he's reviewing the Columbian magazine. And there's a history with the Columbian magazine concerning Some Words with a Mummy. It was supposed to appear in the February 1845 edition of that paper. It didn't. Something else by Mathew appeared in that edition, I believe. It was a short biographical sketch writing about the illustration of Benjamin Franklin, who was Mathew's namesake, doing his kite experiment. That's Mathew's prose. I'm quite sure of it. So Mathew's story, Some Words with a Mummy, was supposed to appear in the Columbian. It was announced in January, but it didn't appear. Well, somehow I think Edgar Allan Poe said, oh, that's mine. See, I got a copy of it, because Mathew had shared a copy of it. So Some Words with a Mummy was supposed to come out, probably under the star, I would guess, in the Columbian, in the February 1845 edition, right about the same time that The Raven came out in American Review, see, but apparently Poe blocked it. So that's just speculation on my part, but with good reason. Now here we have this review of the Columbian magazine in the October 22nd, 1847 New York Evening Mirror, for which Mathew is now working. See, Poe quit that paper or was fired right after The Raven was published in the Evening Mirror. I think he claimed to have permission, and he actually did not have permission to scoop American Review, and he got fired for lying. But I can't prove that. It's just circumstantial. Anyway, he writes, the November number of this, the most popular of the $3 monthlies, opens with 3 very praiseworthy steel engravings. That's what Mathew had been writing the descriptions of the steel engravings in 1845. All fine designs well executed, although the last is, upon the whole, the best of the 3. And he goes on, let's see, it is intended as a fashion plate, as an illustration of ladies' riding costume for the month, but is in fact a well-drawn and well-grouped picture, embracing a lady, a gentleman, and a horse. The schoolmaster returning home is perhaps intended as a sly hit at the well-known schoolmaster who has been so long abroad. That's a joke. It's actually extremely funny, but I don't have all the details. There was a British member of the Parliament, I think, or the House of Lords, who gave a speech. And I have the name, but I don't have it right in front of me. And he was trying to suggest that it was much more important to send teachers abroad, that they would have more influence than by sending their armies. But he put it in terms, he says, there's somebody much more important than the soldier. The schoolmaster is abroad. And see, all of these men that were listening to this speech, they'd all been flogged by schoolmasters. They hated and feared schoolmasters. So the idea that the schoolmaster had been sent abroad instead of the soldier was hilarious to them, because they could just imagine that the soldier is, quailing from, engaging the enemy. The schoolmaster goes in, see? So it was uproariously funny, and it went on for some time as a joke. So that's what he's referring to. The little hero, which stands number 1 in the series, is a popular subject, a boy protecting his little brothers from a wolf. The contributors are, in general, by such authors as Mrs. Osgood, whose vein of graceful pathos seems inexhaustible. Well, that was a friend of Edgar Allan Poe, so that's a little bit of a dig at her. Mrs. C.H. Butler, Mr. Sloman, Miss Russell, John Inman, Reverend J.N. Danforth, T.S. Arthur, who wrote very moralistic kinds of stories, and William Wallace. The critical notices are, as usual, racy, which didn't mean pornographic at that time, just interesting, and judicious, although brief. Now, I looked at these pieces and this issue. The poem by William Wallace really looks like something that would have made Mathew think of Abby. And this is very typical, that anything that strongly reminded Mathew of Abby, he would remark upon. You'd never know, the public would never know that's what it was. But he kept her memory alive in all these things. So here it is, The Husband to His Dying Wife by William Wallace. Be gentle, gentle, she will soon pass from my sight away. Gently, most gently, soon the light must leave the lovely clay, making me desolate. A while I shall behold thy tender smile beam like an Eden ray, and I must walk when it has flown along the world's great paths alone. I think this touched Mathew deeply, so much so that he was motivated to review, and I think he was leaving a trail. I honestly think that Mathew did leave a trail for posterity, hoping that someone who was seriously interested in his work would follow that, kind of hoping against hope is what I feel like. The chances were so slim, that anybody would really follow up on his work, but he still left this breadcrumb trail. I haven't had a lot of sleep, so there's going to be a lot of edits in this. Some I can cover with, graphics, and some I can't. To the matter of Cornelius Mathew, there's quite a bit surrounding this particular character, but I found a book, which I have right here, the 1850 first edition. It's called Chanticleer, A Thanksgiving Story of the Peabody Family. There it is. It's unsigned. There's no indication of Cornelius Matthews on this anywhere. It says Boston, B.B. Mussey and Company, New York, J.S. Redfield. So those are the printers in the two cities, 1850. And here for the, for the registration, entered according to the Act of Congress in the year 1850 by J.S. Redfield in the clerk's office of the District Court of the United States for the Southern District of New York, And the preface is unsigned. The entire book is unsigned. There's no indication of Cornelius Mathews in the 1850 edition. By the time it gets to 1856, and I'll put that up on the screen, I don't have a copy of that. I'm not going to spend like $70 for a ripped off book. Cornelius Mathews is listed as the author. Now, how did that happen? First off, looking at the style of this book, I know from style analysis and from intuition that this was primarily written by Abby Poyen. This is Abby Poyen's only novel, to my knowledge. It would have been written around 1833, 1834, when Mathew was writing 5 books that have been mistakenly attributed to his former editor, Asa Green. Mathew edited, without being listed as the editor, the New York Constellation from about 1830 to about 1832, when he left because of a cholera epidemic. At that point, he wrote 5 books, and I won't go into those right now, but one of them, The Debtor's Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier, is a very early example of Mathew writing social reform literature before A Christmas Carol, before The Rag Picker, and it's very, very good. And the other 4, The Perils of Pearl Street, is somewhat well known because it's the first time that anybody wrote about the internal workings of the stock market in New York City. The price is very high on an original copy of those, so I have a very nice copy of that, modern copy. So Abby was writing this about the same time, probably 1833, something like that. And Mathew helped, but it's mainly her writing. It's her style, which I know because I can compare with her other short stories, which Mathew published for her posthumously. I think Mathew, in 1849, Mathew started publishing these short stories by Abby, signed AP, her initials, and these were not Albert Pike, who falsely claimed her poems under those initials. I think around this time, he said, well, I'd also like to publish her novel. And he said, well, Cornelius Mathews owes me quite a bit of money, which he never paid me. If he will take it upon himself to publish this book in New York, then I'll forgive him the debt. And this was Mathew trying to be a good Christian, trying to turn the other cheek, trying to forgive. Didn't work too well, in a lot of instances. It's like his Joshua Greening character kind of foretold what was going to happen with him and Cornelius Mathews. He's screwed again by somebody in New York, and it was his own editor. Well, he really shouldn't have done this because he should have known that Cornelius Mathews had, in fact, scammed him, swindled him, and that he was going to swindle him again. And this was Mathews failing. He would turn the other cheek to people that were not of good character, and they would just take advantage. This is what happened with Charles Dickens. It's what happened with Edgar Allan Poe and any number of people. So I think that he gave this book to Cornelius Mathews and said, if you'll publish this for me in New York, I'll forgive the debt. So Cornelius Mathews did, anonymously, but it was so good. And this is the other problem. Mathew's work wasn't just anybody's writing. It was extremely good, and Abby's as well. Both of them were child prodigies and literary geniuses, I would say. So it was so good that maybe his family believed that he had written it. And to keep it anonymous, he kind of went along with that. And then they told other people who told other people, and word got around that he was the author of this book, Chanticleer. So when it came time to reprint it, because it was so popular, it had to be reprinted. So when it came time to reprint it, he went ahead and let his name go on it as the author. He never touched this book other than to get it printed, I think. So that's another little thread in our tapestry. Let's see what I have next. In the Portland transcript, we're now going to go back to October and November of 1842. Mathew, as I believe, wrote an entire series defending Swedenborg against somebody who had written against him. They begin in the October 22nd, 1842, Portland, Maine transcript, if anybody wants to look this up. And the signature is one that would be typical for Mathew, especially if he were writing for the Boston Chronotype later on. I'm going down to the bottom. Judex falsitatis, which means a judge of the false, I would say in Latin. I'm not a Latin scholar, but that one's pretty easy. And this is I think it's a 5-part series. He says, a reply to some late comments in the Mirror, so somebody had written in the Mirror, on the doctrines of Swedenborg. I'll just read a little bit of this. Of late, there has been a series of comments on the doctrines of Swedenborg in a religious paper called the Mirror of this city, so it's not the Evening Mirror, edited by Reverend Asa Cummings, who, in the onset, cautions the writer to be correct in his quotations, as in such a case his paper will be open to no reply. What justice there is in adopting such a course, we will leave it for others to decide. These comments purport to be a fair exhibition of the principles taught by Swedenborg, or at least the writer would have his readers to understand that they can see from what he has written a just representation of the above principles. The writer styles himself Philo Veritatis, which is why Mathew responded with that pseudonym. But the writings appear to exhale a kind of spirit so strongly tinctured with acidity around that name, by which its luster is so much tarnished, that it is difficult to determine whether he really is what he represents himself to be or not. At any rate, he follows the old path of those who have gone before him in his way of thinking, which is by finding fault and condemning principles he knows but little or nothing about. Of principles he does not appear to wish to know anything about, right or wrong, any further than to discover something that does not accord with his own. And if they do not do this, they are bad, of course, in his view, because he sets himself up as a standard by which all writings are to be tried and proved as to their truth and validity. So that applies equally to my own critics here. You know, my higher mind is exactly the same as Mathew's. I would give exactly the same answer and have given in different words exactly the same answer to the people who unthinkingly jump into denial and with the aid of sophistry attempt to discredit me and my work without understanding the first thing about it. So that shows that Mathew indeed was a strong advocate of Swedenborg. Now we're going to go to the New York Tribune, when Mathew was writing as his long accustomed signature, the Star. And this is the body of work which has been mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist. She never really was a transcendentalist. Not really. Mathew was a mystic, which is to say, if not a card-carrying transcendentalist, because he had been taught by Abby, who was really excellent. She had a tremendous grasp of the perennial philosophy from age 14, which you can see by the poetry she wrote, which was falsely claimed and modified by Albert Pike. You can see how this goes. If you do excellent work and you stay hidden, there's a feeding frenzy. All these sharks come in and try to claim some part of your work, see? Well, anyway, let's go to Mathew writing as the Star for the June 25th, 1845 edition. And I now have a physical copy of this. It's in the weekly edition. This is the New York Weekly Tribune of June 28th, 1845. The weekly would come out once a week, obviously, and they would put in the best parts of the previous week's dailies. There are 2 star-signed reviews on this front page of the New York Weekly Tribune. And the first one says Swedenborgianism. And there are actually 3 pieces related to Swedenborgianism. And Mathew goes on. He's not a real fan at this time in 1845 of the Swedenborgian church. I think he has moved away from the church, but he still admires Swedenborg and his teachings a great deal. Let me pick it up from here. That the body of his followers do not constitute a Catholic church, meaning Catholic small c, would be sufficiently proved to us by the fact, asserted by all who come in contact with them, that they attach an exaggerated importance to the teachings of their master, which shuts them in a great measure from the benefit of other teachings and threatens to make them bigots, though of such mild strain as shows them to be the followers of one singularly mild and magnanimous. Now, this can happen to any teacher, that his followers turn it into a religion and become bigots. See, this has happened to Dr. Ian Stevenson, for example. I have a letter in which Dr. Stevenson writes to me, because I was trying to get him in my documentary, and he'd initially agreed, and then he saw that there were people involved with hypnosis, and then he backed out. And we had this discussion, brief discussion by correspondence about hypnosis. And by way of being conciliatory, he wrote me that there was an English case of a little boy who seemingly remembered, I think it was the Hindenburg, and he was thinking of putting him under hypnosis. So it's not true that Dr. Ian Stevenson was absolutely against all use of hypnosis, but his followers today would act that way. And it creates this huge artificial rift between the people like Dr. Peter Ramster in Australia, who came up with some very strong evidence for reincarnation using hypnosis, and the people that follow the Stevensonian methods, who, bless their hearts, and much as Matthew says here, they're kind of mild-mannered bigots, but they've become bigots. You know, this is almost inevitable, really. And if I ever develop a following, I will have people that, you know, have the Sakellarios method, you know, held up as the only method. You know, I hope not. God forbid, you know. Well, anyway, he addresses this, and this obviously is the reason that he has backed away from the church, because they become doctrinal, see. But then he says, for Swedenborg was one who, though entirely open and steadfast in the maintenance of his pretensions, knew how to live with kings, nobles, clergy, and people, without being the object of persecution to any. They viewed with respect, if not with confidence, his conviction that he was, quote, in fellowship with angels. They knew the deep discipline and wide attainments of his mind. They saw that he forced his convictions on no one, but relied for their diffusion upon spiritual laws. They saw that he made none but an incidental use of his miraculous powers, and that it was not to him a matter of any consequence whether others recognized them or not, for he knew that those whom truth does not reach by its spiritual efficacy cannot be made to believe by dint of signs and wonders. And he goes on about Swedenborg in praise, about Swedenborg's broad-mindedness and his tolerance and so forth and so on. Now, directly under that, although it wasn't directly under it in the dailies, no doubt, is The Nubian Slave, published by Bella Marsh, Boston, 1845. This is a set of lithographs from drawings by Charles C. Green of Providence, Rhode Island. They present a story only too familiar to our thoughts and knowledge, and yet which may, by the power of these outlines, be more distinctly realized by the many than it has ever yet been. These designs have many faults in execution, as must be expected from a young artist new to the drawing of figures. Such outlines require the greatest knowledge of drawing and the anatomy of the human frame, with vigor and exactness of hand, as there is no color or subterfuge of light and shade to hide faults, and the slightest strokes tell. We therefore see the defects of the artist as strongly as we ever shall, and we see also much promise, for there is soul, the power of poetical conception, and a talent at effective grouping. So he goes on about that, but what we see is, once again, Matthew is a Swedenborgian, or at least deeply admires Swedenborg by this time, and he's very interested in art. The Nubian Slave is rather similar in theme to the Greek slave. He has long critiqued art. He's fascinated by artists. He likes to promote their work. He's honest about their strong points and weak points, but these are themes you will see over and over and over with Matthew under various signatures. Again, this is not proof. It's not proof unless you see all of the evidence. Then it's proof, because I have it. I'm just not giving it all to you. Actually, I had the original. I have the original here of that entire series, in the Portland transcript. I forgot to read from it, but just to show it to you, I do have that in its original. Now, another one I have an original of, and I'm not going to show you, is Quails, writing in the April 5, 1851 edition. He visits a Swedenborgian artist. And the reason I'm not going to show that to you is it is under repair. I'm repairing the spine with a little Elmer's glue, which I learned how to do many years ago. I might have told this story, but when I was a kid, I grew up in Miami, and Vizcaya, the mansion Vizcaya, which is on Biscayne Bay, is there in Miami, and you can visit. Well, I was there, fascinated by the place. Of course, I had no idea about a life in that, era, possibly. But I mean, these antiques go back further. So there was a fellow, it seems to me he was on a ladder. Now, why he would be on a ladder repairing a vase is beyond me. But in my memory, he was standing on a ladder and he was repairing a vase. And I was fascinated. I said, well, what are you using, to repair this? And I was expecting some really exotic formula. He says, well, basically, it's Elmer's glue. Well, that impressed me. And ever since, I have not been afraid to use Elmer's glue to repair some of these antique manuscripts. This is just in the spine, where the spine separates. If you put Elmer's glue back there, it's good to go. Let's see. So what I want here is Quails in the April 5th, 1851 edition, visiting a Swedenborgian artist. All right, so here we have in digital form on my Kindle, Boston Weekly Museum, April 5, 1851, from our flying correspondent, which was the byline that Quails used. This was not Osh and Dodge, as the historians believe. They have good reason to believe that, but it was a conspiracy. It was an actual, genuine conspiracy between the editor and Osh and Dodge, the entertainer, to falsely claim this series, which Matthew would not out himself for. And this is going to take a little while, but I think it's important to read this, just to give you an idea of what Matthew was like in relation to artists and spiritualism. From Bucksport, Maine, the place at which our last letter was written, we proceeded to Bangor, where we had the pleasure of again seeing many of our old friends and making some new ones. And among the latter, we would mention with pleasure the name of Timothy O. Paine, P-A-I-N-E, an artist young in years, but possessing great genius. Mr. Paine is a self-taught and natural genius, and we predict that in less than 20 years from this time, Maine will be as proud to acknowledge him her son as Vermont is that she is mother of the eminent and world-renowned sculptor Powers. So here again, he's praising Powers. We should judge that Mr. Paine is not more than 25 years of age, and yet he has wrought several heads in clay, from which he has taken molds and formed plaster busts, which for lifelike expression and accuracy we have never seen surpassed. He was born on the Kennebec, was educated at Waterville College, and since taking his degree has paid his whole attention to crayon drawing and sculpture. But for the want of worldly wisdom, which is indispensable for a person who wishes to climb the hill of fame and fortune, where there are so many heavy-soled boots, with the toes pointed downward to keep him back, he is comparatively unknown. But the light will peep out in time, and if there are any who doubt our prophecy, we hope there are none, we will say, in the language of Captain Cuttle, make a note on it. Now this is Matthew speaking autobiographically or in projection, or in sympathy and empathy for this young man, because he is in the same position. He also has lacked the worldly wisdom to avoid those many heavy-soled boots with the toes pointed downward, like Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens and any number of other people. So then he says, visiting his studio in company with a friend, see, he liked to visit artists, we had the pleasure of examining 3 of the most finished and lifelike busts that it has ever been our good fortune to look upon. And I'll mention here that Quails, when he goes to Europe, is invited to the home of Victor Hugo and writes in similar praise about Victor Hugo. See, this was not Ashendaj the entertainer. The first of the lifelike busts was that of John S. Sayward, Esquire, editor of the Bangor Whig, and if the bust had been painted the right color, we should certainly have spoken to it. We never before had the faintest idea that so much life could be expressed in plaster of Paris. The second was that of Miss M, a teacher and gardener, and the third that of a little girl. But the best thing of all, and indeed the best thing of the kind we ever saw, was an original design of his own, which is in clay and therefore not yet finished, representing the birth of a husband in the spirit world. The spirit of his wife, who had previously died, recognize the projection here, is bending over the prostrate form, her right hand gently placed upon his forehead, and with a quiet, holy, and patient smile, is waiting the gradual change which shall in a few minutes bring into life the now unconscious form of her beloved husband. 6 other spirits, no 2 looking alike, but all having an expression of innocence and indescribable loveliness, are in attendance, sympathizing with the wife, and anxiously awaiting the fast approaching consciousness of the sleeping body. To add to the scene, the sun of the spirit world is just rising. Now, if there's any question as to whether Swedenborg has an influence here, he puts that question to rest. The conception is unquestionably Swedenborgian in its character, but let our religious views be what they may, the man who can closely examine the beauties of this design without feeling its benign influence must be so hardened to the ways of the world as to be dead to all the finer feelings. And he says, Mr. Paine needs to be encouraged and taken by the hand and brought out, and the man who has the power and goodness to do so will, if he lives to see 1870, have cause to feel proud of his conduct. So Matthew, in identifying and appreciating these young artists, would do his very best to promote them publicly in his column. Now, I did look for Mr. Paine's work in this particular piece, and I never was able to find it. I don't think he ever did become famous, particularly, so probably because he promoted spiritualism and Swedenborgianism. You know, that's the kiss of death, you know, in either a Christian or a secular society, to put yourself behind the spiritualist point of view, see. Whereas Hiram Powers, see, the Greek slave, was he kept his Swedenborgianism in the background, whereas this fellow put it right up front. So that's a good way not to be famous. Moving on, let's see if we have anything else here. Okay, in the national era of September 2nd, 1847, and I'm going to pull that up. I don't have a copy of this. They're quite expensive, even if you can find the national era. There is an unsigned editorial, I guess you call it, or essay, dated August 30, 1847, entitled Powers' Statue of the Greek Slave, New York Correspondence. Now, you recognize this is the same period of time that Matthew was writing as XFW from New York City. And this one is New York Correspondence. And John Greenleaf Whittier, Matthew's brother, was the associate editor for the era, okay, the national era. So quite possibly, this was originally a personal letter from Matthew to his brother John Greenleaf, which was then published as New York Correspondence. That's my guess. So he writes, I have just returned from the exhibition room of the National Academy of Design and have gazed for an hour on the Greek slave to which the genius of Powers has given immortality. Now, he said back in September 9, 1847, in that edition of the Chronotype, that he was spending half an hour looking at it every day. He says, it is a marvelous image of grace and purity. Every line and lineament of the figure conveys ideas of loveliness and beauty which impress themselves upon the soul forever. It may justly be placed side by side with, quote, and I don't know what this quote comes from. If I can find it, I'll put it on the screen. The statue that enchants the world. Now, keep in mind that this national era was a major abolitionist newspaper. So was the Chronotype. At the first glance, and when viewed at a distance, the statue seems to lack the high expression which you look for in such a subject. It seems inanimate. But as you gaze upon it, and approaching nearer, study it as you must, with deepened interest, the subduing pensiveness of the beauteous captive sinks at once into the heart. Here art has indeed magnified its office. The sorcery of genius has expelled far hence every impure emotion. Even the dullest spirit owns the influence of this untainted atmosphere, and for a time the imagination and the heart cease to be of the earth, earthy. So what he means is, even though this statue is nude, and even though she reminds Matthew very much of Abby, he's not experiencing lust. He's experiencing love and longing and appreciation for her beauty and the poignancy that she's exposed to view, see? And he says, I rejoice to perceive in the crowd of the fairer sex which thronged the exhibition room evidence of the great progress which has been made in the scale of social refinement. There was but one prude in the room, a boarding school miss probably, whose disgusting affectation of superior delicacy forcibly reminded me of the anecdote of the French and English lady who visited the gallery of the Louvre in company. Oh, la! That is a very indelicate picture, exclaimed the English prude, as the party stood before one of the most exquisite paintings in that famous gallery. I think the indelicacy is in the remark, not in the painting, replied the pure-minded daughter of France. Remember, Abby was French. Once on a time, so runs the tale, the ladies of Boston put calico petticoats on Greenough's little angels. It is evident that in New York, more correct notions of art began to prevail, quote, to the pure, all things are pure. I don't know what that comes from either. But alas, in the midst of the pleasing emotions excited by this admirable work of art, there came sad thoughts of the wondrous hardness of that nature which can weep at sight of an insensate piece of marble, which images a helpless virgin chained in the marketplace of brutal lust and still more brutal cupidity, and yet listens unmoved to the awful story of the American slave. That's Matthew the abolitionist writing to his brother, the abolitionist. There were fair breasts that heaved with genuine sympathy beneath the magic power of the great artist that have never yet breathed a sigh for the sable sisterhood of the South. Last paragraph. As this eloquent statue traverses the land, may many a mother and daughter of the Republic be awakened to a sense of the enormity of slavery as it exists in our midst. Thus may art, indeed, fulfill its high and holy mission. Let the solemn lesson sink deep into the hearts of the fair women of the North and of the South. Waste not your sympathies on the senseless marble, but reserve some tears for the helpless humanity which lies quivering beneath the lash of American freemen. Again, that's Mathew Franklin Whittier, the poet, writing an abolitionist, writing to John Greenleaf Whittier, his brother, the poet and abolitionist. Finally, we have, in the Boston Chronotype, the June 29, 1848 edition, an account of a slave auction in New Orleans. This is written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. There were 3 parts to this series. The first 2 were the first 2 descriptions in 2 parts of the slave auction. The third one was about a cemetery, a new cemetery in Boston, and at the end of it, he mentions one of Abby's favorite songs, I Would Not Live Alway, and that was by way of dedicating his danger that he'd gone through, his efforts, and that expose to Abby, to her memory. So I'm going to read as my closing piece here, this first installment by Graphomania, which is Mathew Franklin Whittier. It's under the heading Facts and Imaginings. This is number 1, again in the June 19, 1848 edition of the Boston Chronotype. And this is a slave auction that he himself had slipped into when he was undercover in New Orleans, writing for the Daily Delta was the name of the paper. He had done that over the summers of 1846, right after he left the New York Tribune. And this first summer in 1846, he signed with his initial F, which was the same signature he had used in the first 2 volumes of The Dial. So Matthew was also F in The Dial. I have evidence for that. It wasn't Margaret Fuller, the editor. So here he's picked up his middle initial F again. in the New Orleans Daily Delta in 46. When he did this stint again, he was undercover. He was contacting the Underground Railroad where it began in the South. And he did not sign with anything. It was unsigned that year. And in 1848, he just did a couple pieces. And then when he left, possibly hurriedly, and got back to Boston, he published this expose. He starts out with a quote, "And thus they plod in sluggish misery, rotting from sire to son, and age to age." I've presented this before, so I'll put up whose quote that is. I think that might be Byron. Now, I have given this before. I think I've read the whole piece, but I'll do it again for anybody who's new and hasn't heard that one. Our patience is fairly exhausted by hearing the sentimental whine about the institution of slavery, which should not only be tolerated, but for the sake of benevolence be supported. Bah! Mrs. Humbug, what do you know about slavery, save from the look at your cousin George Washington Froth's footman, and you, Miss Clementine Angelina Snooks, but from the gentle attentions of your Aunt Belinda's waiting maid? Talk not to us of the kind care of a rich and an independent Northerner to his slaves. If you would see slavery in all its hideous blackness, go into the midst of it, look at it in all its phases and bearings, talk with the man dwarfed into the brute, count his privileges, weigh his opportunities, and measure the span of his existence. After you have comprehended the individual, the unit, multiply it into the millions, and then stand and gaze long and seriously upon the lowering curse that lies over our land. A few weeks since, while lounging away a summer's morning in the rotunda of the St. Charles at New Orleans, the advertisement of a sale of slaves caught our eye. 100 plantation slaves, the property of a gentleman forced to sell them to raise money to meet the payment of his notes, then coming due in the city. The whole to be sold to the highest bidder without reserve. We had already in our southward course looked upon the slave toiling doggedly at his unrequited labor. We had seen him scarred and maimed by the lash. We had beheld the stern glance of hate and heard the muttered threat as he bowed grudgingly to his servitude. We had even walked several times through Gravier Street and wonderingly peered into all the warehouses where the human animal is fattened, gaudily decked out, and exposed for private sale. See, I think this one he attended was a private sale. I tried to look it up. I'm pretty sure it was private, but for some reason he had to couch this as a public one. I think he was snuck into a private sale, and he didn't want the people that snuck him in to have reprisals. We had oftentimes even made pretense of purchase for the opportunity of asking questions and getting at the thought that we knew to be teeming madly under the immovable muscle of the ebon visage. That means that he pretended to buy slaves so he could interview them. But here was a new spectacle. 100 men, women, and children were to be sold at public auction, again I think it was private, for money to pay notes with. At 12 o'clock precisely, the hour appointed, I was at Hewlett's Exchange, the place of sale. The arena was already filled with the anxious purchasers, with catalogues in their hands. Most of them seemed gentlemen planters in pursuit of slaves for their own use, but among these were several speculators, traffickers in human flesh, without the fear of God or devil before them. This class were conspicuous for their particular examination of the articles on sale. We noticed one hardened old sinner in particular. He had fixed his eye upon a young girl of some 15 or 16 summers. Now, this was the age that Abby was when he fell in love with her, began courting her at 16. She was of a beautiful rounded form and had the head and face of a Venus. She would have been a queen in her own sunny clime, but here she must choke down her agony and tamely submit to insult. "Open your mouth, you slut," sternly muttered the purchaser, and he suited the action to the words and thrust apart the lips and teeth of the girl. "Sound teeth, can eat your full allowance of grub, I'll be bound." Then followed certain rubs and pinches upon her arms, shoulders, breast, and neck, such as a judicious horse jockey bestows upon the animal for which he is in treaty. We hoped, for the sake of common decency, if from no other motive, that his examination would end here, but we were disappointed. This is one of Matthew's favorite little literary devices, to be disappointed, kind of in an ironic sense. He was not the man to purchase a commodity without first fully understanding its value. Let's see your ankles, your knees, up higher, you silly wench. This was too much for the poor girl. A faint blushing tinge crept under her dark skin, and the tears started to her eyes. And this hardened villain had a daughter of his own about the same age. What would have been his rage at the suggestion of the same process to his own daughter? Where is the difference? If any, the delicacy of character would probably preponderate in favor of this poor enslaved girl. But she is placed upon the platform, so far above the floor as to be conspicuous to all the house. The auctioneer possessed an indifference sufficiently brazen to have knocked down St. Paul himself to the highest bidder. Who bids? What's offered? Fine wench, rather delicate in appearance, little ticklish, shy at this age, came of a good stock, no doubt will be a good breeder. Come, come, bid away. 500, 550, 650, 800. Well done, sir. You have discovered her value. 800 once, 800 twice, $800 and gone. Well, Mr. Holdfast, you have got a rare bargain there. I hope I shall have the selling of the progeny. Don't let there be too many yellow ones, though. Them always hurts my feelings to sell. The misery of the poor black girl was now at the highest. She had fallen into the hands of the brutal speculator, and her fate could be imagined from the treatment already received from him. She continued in the position in which her natural gracefulness had at first thrown her, and such an eloquent expression of despair, depicted in her every form and feature, we never saw or imagined before. In the marked catalogue before us, we find that Jane was sold to a Mr. Holdfast for $800. Mr. Holdfast takes his property and places it in a corner, evidently intending to add more to it in the course of the sale. A further account of this scene in our next. So that's a few threads in the tapestry. Can you see how they all fit together? Can you see how this is all the same author with the same themes, the same personal proclivities and beliefs and perceptions, the same higher mind that I have today? It's all the same writer. I have been watching people visit my profile and look at my papers and download my papers on Academia EDU and directly. I've been watching some people just react with ignorance. I've seen every reaction except someone saying, I would like to talk to you respectfully and learn from you and discuss this. You know, that has not happened. So we have all of these people silently lurking and looking, and I don't know if they're conferring amongst themselves, how can we stop this person, you know, or, you know, what can we do about this? How can we steal this from him if it's true? Because this is huge. I mean, I'm sitting on this huge discovery, you know, and I'm a nobody. So there's people that would love to, if this has to come out, I'm sure there are people who would love to be the one who brings it out, not this nobody, you know, Stephen Sakellarios, who believes in reincarnation and is going to drag proof of reincarnation into the discussion, which is my intention. Or there are people who say it's about time somebody exposed Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens, but I don't dare put my name on it. I don't dare. I'll lose my position. You know, I won't be able to get a job as a professor, as a college teacher anywhere in the world if I come out for this. That's also possible. So I don't know what's happening, but what's not happening is me saying, oh, they must be right. I must be crazy. I must be wrong. I must be imagining all this, and then crawl back into my hole and, you know, go get a job sweeping floors or something. That's not happening because I know full well the results that I've got. You know, first off, I'm still Mathew Franklin Whittier in here, and a higher mind up here. It's just the physical personality in the body that's not here anymore. The rest of it's here. So I know on that level, and I've become a pretty darn good researcher at this point after 11 years of on-the-job training. And I know my detective work is solid. Lately, I've been watching on YouTube the Nero Wolfe series, you know. Nero Wolfe, written by Rex Stout, that was something that my guru, Meher Baba, used to have read to him aloud when he was doing his inner work, you know, in seclusion. He would have the stories read to him. And they are excellent. The writing is just magnificent in those, top notch. Better even than Sherlock Holmes, I think, personally. But anyway, I mean, you know, of course, I don't figure out who done it, you know, because they don't really give you clues for that, you know, until the end of the show. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with my detective logic, as you've seen here. All of these are correct. All of these attributions are correct. I'm really not guessing, even the one in the National Era. I'm absolutely certain by style that that was Mathew Franklin Whittier. And most of them I can prove outright. XFW I can prove. Quails I can prove. You know, what other ones do we have here? The series of defending Swedenborg, I can't prove it, but that's him. The Star, I can absolutely prove that now too. Graphomania, I'm certain about. You know, I'm not guessing about these things. Well, we're at almost an hour and a half. This will probably edit down to maybe an hour 20 or an hour 15, something like that. So I would guess that there's almost nobody who's out of the anywhere from like 9 to 40 or 50 people that are looking at these videos. I bet nobody will get this far, you know. But if you do, I'm not kidding around with this. This is all I've done is to take one little thread, the Knickerbocker cayenne pepper thread, and pull it. And I came up with all of this material. I could have gone much further with this. That's just one little, if this is a tapestry that was 10 feet across, this is just a little area, about an inch, you know. That's why my books are so big. Not because I like to, you know, to express myself. It's because there's that much evidence, you know. All right, well, that's enough for now. Maybe somebody will watch this someday.